everyone, and welcome to episode 55 of the Retrospectives podcast, Syberia. James, are you keen to be talking about point-and-click adventure games? This is our very first one.
Yeah, actually, I know how much you dislike this genre at a baseline, so I've always been kind of hesitant to dive into this genre with you, Pat. I feel like any episode on point-and-clicks that we do is just going to be ragging on them from start to finish.
I mean, I don't think I hate point-and-click adventure games. Like, I've played, Monkey Island, and I've played The Longest Journey. I've played a few of the classics, and I certainly didn't hate them. It's just I have that obsession with that one Old Man Murray article about it, and I think it just makes an excellent point. These point-and-click adventure games, and many adventure games in that ilk, have just complete nonsense in them, masquerading as puzzles. And I really enjoy puzzle games, and I think in a lot of cases, point-and-click adventure games end up being just bad puzzle games. Does that mean the genre is inherently flawed? Maybe not. There might be good and bad ones, but I'm not as foaming at the mouth as I was with JRPGs.
Well, this week we are doing Syberia, so we'll find out if this one has or has not stood the test of time.
Yeah, James and I make up the Retrospectives podcast. Each and every fortnight, James and I play through a classic game of the past, with the intention of reviewing it and discussing it and talking about whether it's truly stood the test of time. This is not a nostalgia podcast. We're not here to celebrate a game or appreciate it in the history of it or the merits of it when it was released. We simply want to know whether this game has truly stood the test of time and whether it's worth your time to play today. As James said, we are playing Syberia. So Syberia was developed by a French company called Microids and was released in 2002 for PC, Xbox, and PlayStation 2. And then it saw a bunch of releases on a variety of consoles, the later Xbox and PlayStation consoles, on the 3DS even, and most recently it saw a release on the Nintendo Switch. So just on a very basic level, it's a semi-surrealistic point-and-click adventure game where you travel through fictional parts of France, Germany, and Russia. Kind of alternate history / semi-surrealist. It's kind of a version of Earth and a version of Europe, but there are some very different things about it. And you're following in the wake of a man with a genius for mechanical clock-like mechanisms, and that also influences the, aesthetics of the game. Before we get into the discussion about this game, its story and its atmosphere and all that kind of stuff, I think it's worth touching on how we played this game, because James and I realized we were playing rather differently in the end. So we have slightly different experiences. So James, how did you play Syberia this fortnight?
Yeah, so originally we'd both planned to play on the Steam release of Syberia 1, which, both of Pat and I downloaded and started to get running. And then I ran into a lot of roadblocks actually getting it to run on my computer. And after trawling through the Steam forums for quite a while, I found out that you can't play the game very effectively if you're running a 1440p monitor, which I recently purchased, and has been an ongoing hassle every time I try to play one of these old games for the show, funnily enough. So I, after spending about an hour trying to get it working, gave up because I realized there was a $4 version of the game on my Switch. So I, bought it again for a pretty cheap price, downloaded it, and it worked, flawlessly. The Switch version is actually pretty good. I don't know if it was in your version of the game on PC, but there was actually a little menu that you could drop down that told you what your current objectives were in the game world. So I found it helped a lot with, that issue you run into a lot in point-and-click adventure games where you don't know what you're supposed to be doing. You can play the game either in, handheld mode or docked with a controller, or you can just use the touchscreen and play it as if it is, the original gameplay where, it acts as a mouse, essentially. I played the game start to finish using the control stick because I hadn't actually realized you could use the touchscreen. And I kind of feel a bit silly now because it's definitely the better way to play if you do pick up the Switch version, in my opinion.
Yeah, so the PC version didn't have that objective drop-down menu, or if it did, it remained hidden from me for my entire playthrough. I think the other notable difference is I read that the Nintendo Switch has a way to highlight items and environmental things to interact with. Did you have that turned on?
No, I did boot up the Switch this afternoon after you mentioned that to me, and I can confirm if you're playing in touchscreen mode, there are arrows all over the screen to say where you can and can leave the area, and objects in the game world do have like a highlight around them, so you can very easily tell what you can pick up and what you can't, which is actually probably really useful for this style of game, I think.
Yes, and we'll get more. We'll talk about that a little bit more when we get to the gameplay discussion part of it. But yeah, point and click adventure games. A large part of it is being able to identify items in the environment that you can interact with. If you're playing the PC version, you kind of have to do a bit of hovering your mouse around the screen to find things. If things are just highlighted for you, like in the Switch version, that just doesn't exist. You know where you can click to get results.
Yeah, absolutely.
So the other big difference that I wanted to highlight was I played in a different language to James. So one of the advantages of playing on PC is that you can play in different languages. And with a little bit of trickery, you can set it up so you're playing with subtitles, because the game doesn't natively include English subtitles. So because the game was originally a French title, I elected to play in French, and we'll include a guide to playing in French with English subtitles. But essentially what you do is you download certain files in French, then you change back to English, and you move those files into the right folder. It's all pretty straightforward, but you download both the French and English files, and then you can swap them however you choose. Normally we do an explanation and everything, but I think since we're talking about language, we may as well jump into the nature of the voice acting. So I just want to say the French voice acting was fantastic. I was very impressed with it from start to finish. There were one or two voice actors that weren't, great, but they were still good. And the actors that were good, that were fantastic. I did a little bit of listening to the English voice acting, and it seems like while Kate is well voice acted, many of the side characters aren't nearly of the same quality as her. So, James, did you have anything to say about the English voice acting? Did you have any issues with it? Was it great? Was it good? Was it fine?
Yeah, so it doesn't usually come up very often on this show, but I'm pretty critical of voice acting in general, myself, when I play a lot of games, and I really didn't have any issues with the English voice acting in this game. I did think there were some that were subpar, especially in the first areas of the game, but later on there are quite a few voice actors that do add a lot of character to the characters that they're portraying, notably a lot of the automatons, and a couple of the more eccentric characters have some pretty good voice actors behind them. So, on the whole, I didn't really have any issues. I thought it was perfectly acceptable. Nothing spectacular.
I will point out there's one more readability issue. When you're watching an anime or a foreign film, they tend to segment the subtitles far better, so you'll only get a sentence or two at the time, and it's pretty easy to match up reading that sentence with what the character is saying. It's not nearly as easy in Syberia. Often you get a massive chunk of text that starts scrolling down your screen, and you have to really concentrate to match the voice acting with the English subtitles that are appearing on the screen. It is a little easier than something like anime because they're both root Latin languages, so a lot of the words you can match up if you lose your place. But at times I definitely lost it and had to re-find where it was matching up.
I had a big problem with the subtitles on the English version because the characters talk a lot slower than the text scrolls. So, the text scrolls out of view oftentimes before the characters said the line, which was really, really annoying. I'm surprised they didn't fix that in the release, but not a major issue if you're listening to it in your native language.
Yeah, and that's never an issue if you're playing on PC and playing with the subtitles, because the French language matches up perfectly with the subtitles. I recommend that if you're playing on Steam that you should play with the French voice acting, but it seems clear that the English voice acting isn't horrendous or anything. maybe it's a case like it is for Sekiro, where while the Japanese voice acting is superior, the English voice acting is still quite good.
If you're not so hot about the French recommendations and you can get it on Switch, I actually do think that the touch mode of the Switch version is the superior way to play the game, just because of the highlighting and the fact that you don't need to use the analog sticks to move your characters around, and everything just kind of works. The game never crashed on me or anything like that. I think point and click adventures lend themselves to handhelds really well. Like, you can just put it down and pick it up whenever, because you're never in a rush. Like, it's not like sometimes you're in a fight, so you don't want to pause the game. It's just like a really chill, lazy way to play the game, and I really enjoyed it.
One final thing, I know we're talking about this a lot, but it does impact how you play the game. I was playing on PC, and at times I would Alt-Tab. When you Alt-Tab, this game sometimes has some serious graphical issues. So you'll lose textures on the screen, and a lot more concerningly, the 3D models of Kate and others will start bending and folding in on themselves into weird geometrical monstrosities. It's actually a common glitch for a lot of these early 3D games. You see it when you play like the early Resident Evils and Silent Hills. It's quite hilarious. The worst one was there's a character in a wheelchair, and the wheelchair model started spinning the model around in a circle when the wheelchair went. Yeah, it was very disturbing. Luckily, if you kind of leave a major area, there seem to be like major transition screens and minor ones. So if you go through a major transition screen, it resets everything back to normal. But if you Alt-Tab, you're going to suffer some temporary pain until you can get it reset. But that was really my only technical issue that I encountered. I assume that wasn't happening on the Switch version.
No, I had basically zero technical issues with the game whatsoever. So, that's a pretty good thing for the console port in my mind. So with that out of the way, did we want to start getting into talking about Syberia?
Yeah, so I think what I'll do is I'll give a brief description of the story. Then we'll jump into an explanation of kind of like how these games work for people who are unfamiliar with this style of point-and-click adventure game. And then we'll get into the discussion.
Sure, let's go.
So Syberia starts with you playing as an American lawyer called Kate Walker. And you've been sent to this French village called Validaline. I'm probably butchering the pronunciation. It's a French village. Just bear with me. Which is a quaint little village that seems to be dominated by a toy factory. In this town's past, there was this big toy factory, and that informed the business of most of the town. You've been sent there to get the signature of the owner of the toy factory to transition it to this big mega modern American toy corporation. Think Toy World. Toy World wants to buy out this little niche, but very famously renowned mechanical toy factory. When Kate arrives, though, she finds that the lady Anna Vorarlberg, who is going to sign the contract, has just passed away, and she needs to find her little brother called Hans. But Hans isn't in the town. And so begins a journey where she has to try and find Hans, and she kind of follows in the wake of Hans' life historically. She has to find and repair and get working this mechanical train, almost like a toy train. It's a wind-up train.
It's a clockwork train, yeah.
Clockwork train, but one that's of life scale. And she has to try to follow him to find Hans, to get him to sign this contract so that she can close the deal and move the purchase of this toy factory to this mega toy corporation. And along the way, of course, as is common in adventure games, she faces many trials and tribulations and obstacles in her path to achieving her goals. So that's the baseline story, and we will jump into a more substantial discussion of the story. But I kind of want to talk about, the first thing I want to talk about, the main thing I want to get into with Syberia is the atmosphere. But I think first I need to explain how these games work. So the way these games work, the way these point-and-click adventure games work and Syberia functions is, it is a 2D game with 3D models where you transition from screen to screen by clicking on the edge of the screen. Kate Walker is in, say, a village, and there's a road that goes in two directions. On the screen you're on, there'll be items to interact with. And if you click on the edges of the screen, Kate will walk to the edge of the screen, transition to the next part of the village, and it will just change in a snap to the next part of the village, and there'll be other things to interact with. And they basically use trickery to get these 3D models to work on these 2D screens. You know, as you go in certain areas, she'll shrink, but it's all smoke and mirrors. The backgrounds are 2D, all the models of the characters you're interacting with, and Kate herself are 3D. So the reason I want to start here is that I think from the very beginning of the game, like the moment you get into the game, you will be struck with the beauty of Syberia. The resolutions aren't incredibly high or anything, but because the backgrounds are 2D, they're hand illustrated, and for my money, they're absolutely gorgeous. I think that Syberia is a very beautiful game. They generally don't have a lot going on. They're not heavily animated. They're not any more heavily animated than you would see in a visual novel like Police Noughts. But they do so much to sell the reality of these quaint European villages that I would believe that some of them I thought were photographs, and maybe some of them are touched up photographs. I'd be surprised if they wouldn't. So James, how did you feel about the art style of this game? Did you love it as much as I did? Did you think it was as beautiful as I did?
I do agree with you about the backgrounds entirely. Syberia is a very surrealist game in a lot of ways. Like, the places you're going to are very almost dreamscape-like. Like, they're so surreal, right? Like, you're following this guy through Europe who's left this clockwork legacy behind him, and the way that, like, he's impacted all these different towns and places that you get to visit. And the environments you visit are just so beautiful to look at. They're incredible. I loved every time I got to a new town. I was just blown away by the art. I think that a point and click that has poor art and a poor setting is a point and click that, no matter how good you make the puzzles or gameplay, isn't one that I'm going to enjoy, right? This is a game where you spend, 100% of the time looking at the backgrounds, looking for items, looking for details about the world. So you really, really need to sell this to the audience in order to, succeed at making a good point and click adventure game. I think every single point and click that I've played that I've loved is one with a really unique, fascinating world backed up by beautiful art, and just a joy to walk around in for hours. And I think that Syberia absolutely succeeds in this department. One thing that I think has aged kind of poorly is the 3D character models themselves. They do kind of stick out like a sore thumb on this, incredible background art sometimes. When they're, in the background a bit, like they're far away from the camera, you can kind of forgive it. But anytime it zooms in on a character's face, you're kind of like, ugh, I don't know, it's not great, in my opinion. But, on the whole, blown away by the art direction.
I do agree with that. And it's particularly obvious with the stiffness of their animations. There's nothing fluid here. It is like incredibly stiff to the point where they're like turning in place. And this isn't just the automatons. This is the human beings where you can see them physically rotate 90 degrees at a time to assume the right position to step forwards. It's pretty disconcerting. And I think that if they had been able to somehow create 2D models, it would have been even better. But I don't know how that would work. They still do fit the world they're in. They're just a little awkward compared to the beauty of the backgrounds.
One thing, I think the reason that Patrick picked the game for the show this week, as opposed to many other point and click adventures, is that I think people were trying to sell you on the atmosphere of Syberia, correct?
Absolutely. When there were a few people who suggested this, and every single time they used the word atmosphere to say that it is a game you should play.
Yeah, so how did you feel about that on a whole? Does Syberia succeed in creating this atmospheric experience?
Yes, it absolutely does. And the art style is part of that, but it's also the details and the and the themes and the feel of what the game is like. Because you have small details like the ambient sound, and often it's just birds chirping, or in the very first town you go to, it's raining, and then after the rain ends, you can see a few puddles on the street, and it's reflecting the buildings around. But it's also in the subject matter. You're kind of pouring through or following in the wake of Hans's life, and the places you go are not bustling centers of activity. Every single one is like past its heyday. You go to the university and there are like just a couple of students around. A lecturer delivers a lecture and there's like 3 other students in the lecture hall with you as you're listening. You go to a spa and there's barely any people there. They're all ghost towns. Like, you can feel that at some stage all of these places were beautiful and bustling and filled with people and activity and excitement, but now it's just kind of sad. Like, not in the sense that, you know, you break down crying, but in the sense that these places, like, the world has passed them by. I felt this way when I went to England. I unfortunately haven't been to the rest of Europe, but I felt that kind of melancholy at, you know, this is not part of the modern world. This belongs to another age. It's very whimsical.
It's like there's this sense of wistfulness throughout the entire game, I suppose, because you're kind of following 2 timelines at the same time. While you never really, you know, visually see the second timeline, as you go to each of these places that Hans, the character you're chasing throughout the game, has gone to, you hear these stories about his exploits, about the great mechanical contraptions he's created that have, you know, changed the course of history for the people who lived here now and, you know, in the past and up until now. You know, it's like there's 2 versions of these places, and one of them is created in your mind through, you know, old journals that you've read and accounts that people have told you through the game. You get this very, I guess, like, solid grasp of what this place was like previously, although you never actually get to see it, you know, in the prime of its life. And there's something kind of, you know, melancholy about that. It's really beautiful in a way, I think.
Yeah, and it's a consistent theme throughout, because you've got the opera singer who's, you know, lost her voice and has passed her glory days, and you try and get her to live that moment of being a glorious opera singer once more. And you've got the university professors who once, you know, ran this big, bustling, busy university, and now it's a shell of its former self. I think that there's kind of a criticism hidden in this game, a criticism of capitalism and the modern world, because Kate gets very caught up in pursuing her adventure, and the deeper she gets into her adventure and history and, I guess, something a little simpler, the more the modern world and the more reality seems to be left behind. And there's something glorious about her getting swept up in this adventure and rejecting and, I guess, paying less attention to the world that once used to be everything to her as a lawyer in a big competitive law firm.
Yeah, one of the biggest running themes in the game, in my eyes, is the idea of people kind of like resting on their laurels, and, you know, they had the prime of their life, and now they're just kind of living out this lesser existence after the fact. The idea that it doesn't have to be that way. The right time to embrace your life is always now. One of the biggest, like, themes of the game going, you know, across the whole adventure. And I think it builds up to that towards the end of the game really well. I think all of the characters you meet do have this sense that their life was a lot better previously, and a couple of them even also get up off their feet and decide to do the things that they were always too afraid to do throughout the journey. And I think it all really interlocks really well to each other and plays into, I guess, you know, that atmosphere that we're talking about.
In summary, I think the atmosphere of this game is magnificent. This is a beautiful game, not just in its graphics, but in the feeling it creates as you go through its world. And I really loved the world of Syberia, and like James, every time I got to a new location, I was excited to explore it, excited to see what there was to see. There's something about this game that speaks to my heart. Not just because I think it's pretty, but because I think that thematically it speaks to adventure and the melancholy of a world that's been passed by really well. Once again, the environmental storytelling on here is magnificent. For me, I got more from exploring its world than I did from the main story.
Well, I mean, I think one of the biggest things the game is trying to drive home is the idea of journey before destination, right? Like, I think that the whole game you're chasing after this guy, just one little stop extra on the train and he'll be there. Just one more bit and you'll be able to find this guy and finally go home. But once you finally get there, you realize that the fun of the game was that journey on the way. And I think the game does sell that to you really well. One more thing on the atmosphere. I actually aren't as high on it as you are. Mostly because I think it's let down in part by the sound. I think the visuals do like 80% of the heavy lifting, with the rest being from the story. And oftentimes when I was playing this game, I noticed a really distinct lack of ambient noise in the background, like stuff like, whistling wind and birds chirping, which there was a little bit of. But so many times I just felt like the game could be even more atmospheric if there was just a bit of noise in the background. Sometimes, there's the ambient themes that play, some music, and then so much there's just no sound whatsoever for like long stretches. You'll go through like several screens in a row without hearing anything, and I found that very disconcerting at times, and I thought it, let down what was otherwise a great atmospheric experience.
That's very interesting. Maybe I wasn't paying enough attention, but I distinctly remember the game having ambient noises throughout. Sometimes it was very simple, like the whirring of a machine when you were in a factory. But I don't recall screens with literally zero sound. But maybe I just wasn't paying enough attention.
Yeah, I was hearing a lot of that. You'd hear the character's footsteps, but there's nothing like, there's no ambient buzz or like, I don't know. I feel like wind was the main thing that I was like, I felt like there should be wind in like half of the screens, especially in the second area, which is this like big open station. It just and the geography appears to be a huge flat plain with nothing getting in the way of the air. It just felt really bizarre to me.
No, that's a fair point. I think that there is ambient noise on most screens, unless I'm going crazy, but you're right. Particularly on that level, yeah, it's very quiet, far too quiet.
Yeah,
and they probably could have done more with the ambient sound. I kind of feel like when you're in the university, for example, that you shouldn't have ambient sound.
That's
you
fine,
should hear
yeah.
the echoing of the footsteps. But I think they do an okay job at the very least. Even
and
if
to be
it's not
fair, I want to say, this takes it down from being like one of the best ever atmospheric games to being like one of the really good ones. You know what I mean? Like, I still think it's really good. I just think they could have probably pushed it even further. And I was like almost disappointed that they didn't quite get to that, like, top 3 ever kind of games for me, because I think it could have done it. The visuals just nailed it.
Well, James, let's have a music break and we can talk a little bit about the music, or maybe how little music there was. What song did you choose for us?
Yeah, because there was only about like 3 or 4 tracks in the game, maybe less, like you can count them on one hand. So I chose the main theme of the first town that you visit, which the English dub named Valladolid. So I thought that on the whole, what music there was really good. It's very strings heavy, I'm gonna say. This is a European game, and I think that the choice of instruments matched the geography perfectly. It was very, long, drawn out kind of notes. I wouldn't say the music was sad, but I will say it was kind of wistful, right? At times it was like longing for adventure. And it kind of did play into the the themes we were talking about earlier. My biggest criticism again was that there's not enough music. Like, if I had to review each song on their own merits, great, fantastic, but as a whole soundtrack, as a complete package, I felt like they could have been a handful more tracks on the soundtrack.
Completely agree. The main issue was that there wasn't enough music. Most of the music was played as you arrived in places and during cutscenes. And I think it could have done with maybe twice the number of tracks.
Yeah.
I will say at one point there is an opera piece, and it's not very long, but I really liked it. Like I've never gone to an opera or anything, but this particular piece was beautiful. I watched the cutscene. I'm like, man, that was some good singing, and the organs that went with it were really good as well. So.
Yeah, I really enjoyed that as well. It went a lot longer than I was expecting it to go for, but I was actually glad that it went long because the story beats that are leading up to this moment are quite substantial. Like, you do a lot of gameplay to get to this specific, opera show. So the fact that it did have that substantive payoff to go with it made me really happy. So
Yeah.
let's go back a bit. We'll play the opera track later, but let's go to actually let's do that first. Let's play Patrick's opera track while we're talking about it, and then we can wrap back around to Valadolen's theme later. So here it is.
Очи черные, очи страстные, очи жгучие и прекраснее, как ему я вас, как боюсь я вас, знать увидел вас, я в недобрый час. Очи черные, очи страстные, очи жгучие.
That was the opera track. I have no idea what the name of this song is. Maybe I'll add it in editing later when I find it.
Yeah, this one isn't in the official soundtrack. I've just asked James to splice it in for us because a lot of the I was going to pick the piece of music that starts playing when you reach the Russian area. But after listening to the full track, it only starts Russian for like the first 20 seconds and then transitions into another wistful strings-based track. So I'm like, I don't really think this captures the atmosphere nearly as well as I remembered it. So the opera piece is my favorite piece, so James is allowing me to include it.
Yeah. All right. So we've spoken a bit about the graphics and the sound a bit some. Do you want to get into substantive discussion about the story now?
Yeah, so let's go into a bit more detail. So we've kind of talked about the story in vague terms, but now we're going to start moving into spoiler territory. So if what we've said so far sounds like something you'd be interested in, let me just say very briefly that I don't think the gameplay of this game is very good, but it's not agonizingly bad, and I think that it's worth playing today. I'll elaborate more later. If you would really like to experience this spoiler-free, or mostly spoiler-free, you should stop listening now and skip to our gameplay section.
Yeah.
I don't know if you feel the same way, James, but yeah, I don't like the gameplay, but the story and atmosphere is so good that it's worth playing. And if we're going to spoil it for you, then we'll be taking away the most substantive, enjoyable part.
Yeah, the game's like 90% about the story, so, I also will recommend this game. I think it's a great experience. It's very short. It was only like 6 or 7 hours, and it cost me like $4 on the Switch. I thought it was a great time. I played it in 2 sittings maybe. I was just absorbed the whole time. time. So absolutely give this game a recommend. And if you do want to play it, would strongly, stop listening now, play the game, and then come back later, because this will be pretty spoilerific.
Okay, so I think what we'll do is we'll get into some of the specifics of the story now. So, the idea, the specifics of the story is that when so you arrive in this town, and you find out that you need to find Hans. Hans is alive, and in the very first French town you go to, you find Anna's diary, and it kind of explains most of the youth of Hans and how he came to leave this village. What happened was that Hans discovered this toy. It was a prehistoric toy of a boy riding a mammoth in a cave when they were very young. Anna was 11 and Hans was 7 or 8 years old. When Hans went to climb up to get the toy, he tripped and fell and seriously injured himself, and he became intellectually disabled. So he became permanently with the mind of a child. But whether it was from this fall or something he always had, Hans was a mechanical genius, an auteur on a level, think Leonardo da Vinci +++, to the point where Hans could design mechanical creations that are more sophisticated than creations we can create with modern computing today. And that's particularly true when you end up meeting an automaton, a robot that is far beyond our capabilities of
He doesn't like
today.
being called a robot, Patrick.
No, he doesn't. But just to give you an idea, like, he's a mega mechanical genius. But the thing about Hans is that because he still has the mind of a child, he doesn't just create things that are, I guess, mechanically efficient. He doesn't create a factory that looks like a factory. He loves toys. So everything that Hans creates is in the image of a toy. And I just wanted to highlight this as our first discussion point, because I think that it adds so much to the story and world, this being an aspect of Hans's character. Because there's a reason that all of the fantastical creations you see as like stylized after humans. Like when you go to the factory, it's not a normal factory assembly line. It's a factory assembly line where you have like 40 human-like assembly workers. And there's a wonderful little detail that Hans created these parrots as part of this creation to act as whistles to signify different things. And then his dad tried to remove them, saying, "This is redundant. Why are you literally designing these ridiculous parrots?" And Hans threw a tantrum, because to him, it was about creating this magnificent toy. This magnificent thing to look at and observe and interact with. Did you like this, James? Did you like this justification?
Yeah, absolutely. And the fact that, it actually makes some of the gameplay more enjoyable, because all of the mechanical contraptions all over the world that you interact with, because they're like toys, they're kind of also like puzzles, which kind of naturally feeds into the gameplay. I really enjoyed, like, the puzzles that I enjoyed the most in the game were the ones where you were interacting directly with Hans's creations, because they were so, weird and, offbeat. Like, even simple things like doors had to be opened by these like mechanical intricate designs. Like there was this door that was locked, and the only way to open it was to find a bird's egg and place it on this like little scale to balance the counterweight so that it would open the door. And anything like heavier or lighter, it wouldn't open the door, because this is a toy, and it has to work in this bizarre way, because it was created with the genius mind of a child. And I think it adds so much character and personality to the game world. When you go to Russia, there is this like contraption that goes over the top of the train in order to wind the clockwork engine, and it's not like this square thing that goes on rails over the train. It's like a giant dude with these arms holding like a hammer and a sickle. It's, completely absurd, but it just adds so much personality to the areas that you're in. I loved it.
It's ridiculous, but it's justified in world.
Yeah.
Hans has the mind of a child. He likes toys. Because he is the only one who can create the things he can create, it's not like, and because he refuses to do it any other way, if these people that he's working with want access to his creations, they have to accept that they're going to be toy-like.
Yeah.
So if this was a situation in the real world, this is what would happen. He would get his, well, maybe not. Maybe there'd be a bit more arm wriggling, like pulling his arm in order to get him to do what they want him to do. But you can see how this could be a thing that happened.
Yeah, it's like the whole game world is Geppetto's workshop, is the way I describe it. It's just a big toy world. And, Hans being so childlike also makes him kind of exploitable as a person. There's this one specific bit where he's working with the Russian military to design these like rocket launch pads because they tell him, you're going to help us go to the moon because the moon's cool and fun, when in reality it's like World War II or something and they're trying to design, nuclear warhead launch platforms. But the idea that Hans but it's still super ridiculous because all these launch platforms are like these spring-loaded platforms. It's very, very enjoyable.
Even the train you're on, like we said, it's literally a clockwork train. You get to each station and it winds up. There's a specific device at each train station that winds up your train so you can go on the next leg of your journey. And if you can't access the wind up module, well, your train can't go anywhere.
You wind your train up and then it goes as far as it can go and then it stops until you can figure out how to wind it again. I thought it was really funny and it was one of the main obstacles stopping Kate from exploring the world was, getting to a station and being like, oh, holy shit, hopefully Hans has been here because there'll be like a clockwork winding mechanism somewhere.
So as the game goes on, you find you're pursuing Hans to try and get this legal contract signed. But as you start following him, you start learning more and more about what Hans is trying to do. And Hans, in his moment of trying to get that toy of the boy riding the mammoth, has become obsessed with that. And you learn about this tribe of people called the, I want to say Yokult or Yokul.
The Yokels? Yeah.
The Yokels, who are a Siberian tribe who were famous, in the game world, were thought to have domesticated and hunted mammoths. And in the current day in the game world, they live off frozen mammoths, for trade and to continue eating on. And he was chasing a dream that perhaps the mammoths are still around today because, there's a lot of myths and legends about it. So for Hans, his whole life, the moment he left his French village was, I have to find this tribe and I have to find mammoths. And I think that as a motivation for Hans as a driving force of the story and something that's a big part of it, I thought it worked extremely well and it resonated well with everything else that was going on because Hans was longing for a simpler time. Hans was longing for something a little bit magical. And that's also kind of the experience that Kate is going through as she starts leaving her and, becoming more and more detached from her old life as a lawyer in the big city. To the point where when you go to a lecture and a lecturer just explains to you everything about these tribes and these mammoths, I was watching and listening with very focused attention because I found it really interesting.
The really beautiful thing about the story is this child who was impaired very early on was able to have such a profound impact on the lives of everybody he touched, something that becomes very, apparent throughout the course of the game. And that kind of like childlike wonder is something that rubs off very hard onto Kate as the game progresses. And I really loved that progression from start to finish. I don't think it nailed the ending as well as it could have. The game ends very abruptly, in my opinion. Like, I think all the ingredients were there. Like, they did all the work to make the ending work, and then they just kind of like, I don't know, put the cake together wrong right at the end. It didn't quite fit for me. I just like, it's definitely a journey before destination style game, but I still think the ending's a bit of a flaw.
The reason the ending feels garbage is that it feels like half a game. They're building up this Syberia thing. You're getting, as you're getting through this final obstacle, you're getting eager to reach Syberia and see the society and, hopefully see the magic of the mammoths. Because I think it's pretty clear that at some stage you're going to see living mammoths. And it's funny, it's such a small... In some ways, it's a small thing. Like, it's not like you're saving the world or anything. But I think building up towards that and seeing something truly magical would have been wonderful. But the game just ends before you get to Syberia. It's like, all right, I'm ready for the next leg of the journey, and then the game's over. So I don't know if the developers wrote Syberia 1 and 2 and then like, well, we've only got enough funding for one game, so we'll split it into 2 or whatever. But yeah, it ends very poorly, not because Kate's personal arc isn't over, but because it feels like we just have been given half a story. And this is something that The Longest Journey did far better. It would be like if that game's about 20 hours long, about twice the length of this one. And all I could think while I was playing this was like, why have they only given me half the game?
It's really weird, right? Like, you think that it just ends all of a sudden, right? Like, suddenly Hans is there. I don't know why he's there or where he came from. It's like, oh, you found him. There was no big lead up to this happening. It just did happen and the game ended, and there's like a short 30-second cutscene and then the credits roll. It was really feel like it needed a longer outro. I agree with you. It feels like half a game. But the game that I really enjoyed from start to finish. It's funny, we actually haven't even touched on the gameplay yet, and we've been going for about 50 minutes. So, I mean, my overall thoughts on the story is that it's really enjoyable, and even if the gameplay was dog shit, which I don't think it is, I think I would still recommend this game because I loved the story to bits and the characters.
So before we go into gameplay, I just wanted to jump on like what I thought was the worst part of the entire story.
Okay.
So, once again, spoilers, but I mean, by this point, you should be aware of that. At one stage, so a big arc is getting this opera singer back to this Russian factory where this person has converted the factory into a elaborate series of organs. Sorry, elaborate organ. Not organs, that would be far more disturbing, into an elaborate organ, ripped up all the piping that was used in this mining facility and turned it to this beautiful grand organ because he so desperately wants to hear this opera singer sing again. Anyway, you get her back, she starts singing, and then this person drops a metal cage around her, presumably so that she can sing forever. And then she's like, why will someone come rescue me? And you literally immediately walk up to the cage and open it with the bolt cutters that he's convenient that he left for you in the train, and then you use the bolt cutters that you've had this entire time on the hands of the pianist, which are the hands which was the whole reason you went on this elaborate adventure in the first place. You were literally, when you walk in, you have the bolt cutters and you could have fucking used them on the hands immediately. Instead, you do this huge loop solving all these puzzles, then you walk up, free the lady, and take the hands. And I don't know how you would write that differently, but there has to be a better fucking way than that.
Just put a weird thing on the hands that he gives you as soon as you get the opera singer there. That makes it work, right? Like, I didn't mind the whole
anything.
I didn't mind the whole fuck around to get the opera singer there. Like that, like 2 area kind of arc, like was one of the better. Like, was my favorite part of the game. I loved the Russian area. And actually, I think my favorite story-wise was you meet this pilot, this like ex-pilot who's kind of like drunk out of his mind on vodka all the time because he like everything's gone to shit. And my absolute favorite part of the game was him being like, you know what? I need to visit the stars before, I'm too drunk to do anything. So he gets in this rocket and asks you to like fire it into space. And you just do. You just fire this guy into space. And he's perfectly happy with it. And Kate's like, yep, that was fun. It's like, that guy is going to die.
I know, but he got to go to space. I'm sure some people would take that deal.
Yeah. It was just so... That moment was so surreal for me. It was so funny.
But there's lots of weird moments like that. Like when you free the one hawk and it scares off 1,000 birds. I was like, all right.
Oh yeah, and it's
I
like
guess that's
how
it.
it's like how the Zeppelin, when you pull the lever, the engine doesn't start unless the birds are gone.
And you free one hawk, and yep, goodbye 2,000 birds circling around the Zeppelin. It's like, I don't know about this. Yeah, I just wanted to highlight one more part of the storytelling. I swear to God, this is a video game, and we will talk about it shortly. I think at times this game is quite funny. And I think that most of the humor comes from your train driver automaton, Oscar. See, Oscar loves bureaucracy. Like, he loves bureaucracy. So anytime you want to go somewhere, you have to get your ticket stamped. But obviously there are no, people manning these derelict train stations. So what Oscar will do is he'll arrive at the train station. He'll say, "Oh, we have to go get our ticket validated." He'll get out of the train. He'll go into the ticket booth, and then you'll approach him to get your ticket validated. And every single time, I thought it was hilarious. It works within the game world. He's an automaton, so he loves following the rules. And it's a great source of comedy when Kate keeps getting more and more frustrated at Oscar's refusal just to drive the train. And yeah, I enjoyed it a lot.
Alrighty then, I think it's about time we moved on to some gameplay, but just before that, we're going to have another music break, and we're finally going to have a listen to the main theme of Valladolid, which I think is the best piece of, music in the game. Is, the heavy on the strings and suits the atmosphere of the game perfectly. So here it is. That was Valladolid, a piece of excellent music on the very small but quite good soundtrack of Syberia. So as we go into gameplay, there's this idea I want to touch on that we just briefly covered when I was talking about, a lot of the logic not making sense. I think that in a lot of cases, these point-and-click adventure games don't have like reasonable logic at all. And I used to think of this as like a huge negative on the genre, but like the more I think about it, I'm like, these surrealist worlds can't really exist without you like, leaving that logic behind. These funny moments, these crazy scenarios, none of this would work if they were so rigid in their, their rules and their logic. Every time something absurd happened in this game, I found it to be enjoyable and that there was like value in it. And I think that this kind of like weird leap in logic can hurt gameplay when you get situations where like what you'll do in the game is you'll find these items all about the world. And you'll think, where can I use this item to progress the plot? And a problem that a lot of point-and-click adventure games run into is that oftentimes the solution to these questions is completely nonsensical. Like, it's like, I've got this spoon, what should I do with it? And then it's like, use this spoon, jam it in the fuse box to make this, this car work or something ridiculous. Or like, if I give this to this guy who doesn't look like he wants it, it'll progress the plot. I didn't think Syberia had this problem because I think it put its like weird leaps in logic in the right spots in the story, so that it didn't necessarily interfere with the gameplay. And generally, your inventory size is small enough that you're never like in this situation where you're standing in front of a person and you're clicking the first item on them, then the second item on them, then the third item on them until you've gone through like 30 things until it finally accepts the random knickknack it needs to progress the game. I didn't run into issues like that at all. Yourself?
So generally, the puzzles in Syberia and the item puzzles and figuring out what to do next is very easy. Yeah. This game is not a complicated puzzle game by any stretch. However, I do have a combined criticism of how it works in combination with something else. Let me explain. So, the thing about games like this, these point-and-click adventure games, are, as James said, you roam the environment, you pick up objects, you speak to people, then you use objects on environmental interactables and people in the right combinations, and hopefully something works. Most of the time in Syberia, it's pretty obvious. However, when it is not obvious, when you don't know what to do, it's a significant problem. And anytime you play these games, there's going to be a point where where you miss something or don't know what to do or something's not obvious to you. Because in a normal puzzle game, when you don't know how to do something, the parameters are set and you can walk away and do a different puzzle and come back to it later. In a point-and-click adventure game, the thing that you need to do, you might need to do that thing before you can do literally anything else. Often they're gateway puzzles and you have to do things in a specific sequential order. So you get into this funk of wandering around the environment with these items in your inventory, looking at things you've already looked at, interacting with things you've already interacted with, and nothing works because you haven't connected these two single dots. Now, it's a problem exacerbated, and maybe this is different on the Nintendo Switch, but in this game, it takes fucking forever to
walk
move
around. Yeah. I reckon this was probably worse on the Switch because, well, at least when I was playing, like, if you play in touch mode, you can click somewhere and Kate will walk there. And on the PC, I assume with the mouse, you just click somewhere and then they walk there. On the Switch,
there's a double click as well
to run.
Make them run.
Yeah, so on the Switch, I was moving with an analog stick the whole time, so I couldn't just like click and wait. I had to like physically move Kate and hold the run button to get her everywhere. I think the issue that you're trying to get to, I think, is that with most puzzle games, when you've got a puzzle, usually the things you need to solve the puzzle and the puzzle itself are always in the same place. Whereas in this game, it's like the puzzle, like you could need to interact with people on the opposite side of the map in order to solve these puzzles. So there is so much walking. Like, even when you know exactly what to do, even if you had a guide open, it takes a while to progress the plot because you've got to walk from one place to the next and then back to that place and then back. Like, especially if you're trying to do something for like a bunch of characters and you need to talk to all of them to get the puzzle rolling. When you don't know what to do, you end up in this frustrating loop of walking from screen to screen to screen, agonizingly slowly with no way of knowing what you're actually supposed to do. In a lot of puzzle point and click adventure games, you can actually like double click on the edge of the screen to instantly transition rather than wait for your character to move. That is not the case here. You have to wait for Kate to run from one side of the screen to the other. And oftentimes, you'll need to run across 4 whole screens, which can take, like a couple minutes of you doing nothing. Like, I reckon you spend most of the time playing Syberia just waiting for your character to move from one point to the other. It is easily the worst part of the game. If there was instant screen transition, this game would be, the gameplay would be a whole lot better.
James, sorry, just to clarify, because I don't know what it's like on the Switch. When you got to a staircase, did Kate stop before the staircase and then walk up a few steps before the screen transitioned, or did she instantly move to the next screen?
She walked up. Why?
Because in the way it works in the PC version, at least, is that you double click on a transitionary area that has a staircase. Kate needs to orientate herself with the staircase, so it's not like it just goes to the next screen. She literally stops, turns the right way to orientate herself with the staircase, and then she goes step, 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 step. And then the screen transitions, and this is something you have to deal with. And the fucking game is littered with staircases. I would say 3/4 of the transitions are staircases.
Okay, this is funny, because so the way the Switch version does it is that the only way to get to the next screen is to manually orientate Kate that way yourself. Because, like, say, for example, if you run Kate into the stairs, you'll go past, because you need to click on the transition point in order to activate it. If you run into the stairs, you've gone too far. You actually have to walk backwards a bit until it highlights to click OK, so she'll already be in position. But this is really annoying because you have to like fiddly... Like there's this bit in the second area where there are these pigeons on the floor blocking a ladder. And getting up that ladder is a pain in the ass because you need to like move Kate into the exact spot before pressing A to go up the ladder. If you're too close to the ladder, it doesn't work. If you're on the wrong side of the ladder, it doesn't work. Nothing works unless you're standing on like the exact pixel where the arrow highlights. And that's like every transition's kind of like that. I really didn't like it.
So here's the thing. If ever you don't know what to do, you have to deal with this shit. Like, this is something that I think a lot of the time doesn't get highlighted. You have to spend time sitting there waiting, frustrated out of your mind how slowly you're actually moving around the areas that you're in. And it drove me insane. There's this one puzzle where you need to speak to people about these grapes that they tell you about a hidden vineyard. Now, the thing that really made me angry about this was I spoke to the 3 people that I needed to speak to when I had the book about these grapes in my inventory, but I didn't speak to them in the right order. I needed to speak to person A, then B, then C, and I spoke to C, then B, then A. And after I'd spoken to all of them, I'm like, well, I know that they've got these hidden grapes because the game has the dialogue be super obvious that they have a hidden vineyard. But because I didn't speak to them in the order that they wanted, it wouldn't let me progress this stupid plot line. But the thing is, when I was in that spot, I didn't know that that's what I was meant to do. So I then walked around everywhere, was speaking to all the other different characters. I was looking for objects to interact with. I'm like, what have I missed? Maybe there's a puzzle here that I'm not seeing, etc., etc., etc. For 20 minutes, all the time watching these slow transitions, because the game had a weird logical fuck up and it just wasted my time. And that is not a good thing. That is a serious design flaw. And when you play these point and click adventure games, this is the kind of thing that will happen to you at some stage.
Yeah, it's like there's no middle ground. There's either you know exactly what to do, or you are stuck in this painful loop of like trying everything on everything until you can continue. There is no other thing. You either know what to do or you don't, and when you don't know what to do, there's like so many possibilities. The puzzles that I liked in this game were the ones that were all really self-contained. For example, the best puzzle in the game for me was this one near the end of the game, which is like there is this bar that has a whole bunch of drink ingredients at it, and you need to make this special cocktail so that it'll restore the voice of this opera singer. And the bar is very elaborate. Like it's got like a piano attached to it, and if you play the piano right, it dispenses the right drink. Because that was all like in the one spot, even if you didn't know what you were doing, it was just only a matter of time till you figured it out. You knew kind of like what direction you should be looking in to solve the puzzle. It wasn't like you have no idea and you need to wander through, 10 minutes of screens in order to finally figure out, which doohickey goes with what thing. The good puzzles are all self-contained in one location. You don't need to, waste your time with wandering around.
I will say with that puzzle, I didn't think to put the honey in the spa. I had to look that up.
I figured that out, yeah.
I will freely say that I used a walkthrough in this game. I consulted it maybe 5 or 6 times, which is a lot. You probably don't need to consult it that much. It's just after that stupid university thing where, because I didn't speak to them in the right way, I wasted all that time. I basically, if I got stuck longer than about 5 minutes, I just went to a walkthrough because I didn't want to deal with the game's bullshit. So I think that the best way to play this game is to play without a walkthrough, but if you've tried most things and spoken to most people, bust out the walkthrough so you can get on with enjoying the story, which is a really enjoyable part of the game.
Yeah, I think I used to walk through less than you did just because the Switch version generally tells you what you kind of need to be doing most of the time with its little journal. Like it tells you what like missions are outstanding, which I thought was a really handy feature to have because like, I really don't object to using a walkthrough to these kinds of games. With those self-contained puzzles, like, I think when you finally solve them, it feels rewarding and good, like you feel pleased with yourself. With these, like, I don't know which key to use with which person kind of things, I don't feel like I'm a genius because I used, the grapes on these birds or something. I just feel like finally I've gotten to the next bit of the story. So, like, I don't think I'm missing out on any interesting challenge or anything by, consulting a walkthrough. I think that I'm just, getting on with my life. I think at least I'm overplaying it a lot. I was annoyed at the long walking times, but I never, like, other than that puzzle you mentioned, which I also got stuck on because of the same reason that you mentioned, I was never infuriated with the gameplay. I think that as far as these kinds of games go, Siberia's probably on the less frustrating side.
Yeah, I totally agree with that. There's games that I've played of this ilk which use moon logic, and this largely avoids that problem. I just think that there's something just fundamentally kind of shitty about the genre, and it manifests itself in this way. Like, the puzzles here, I just don't really enjoy them. Like, it kind of feels like if you didn't even have the gameplay and it was just about walking around talking to people, I think I would have enjoyed this game just as much. Like, I like walking simulators. The reason people play these walking simulators because they enjoy the story. And in a lot of ways, I think adventure games evolved into walking simulators because they realize you don't actually need gameplay. You can just have exploring a world at your own pace and soaking in the world. And yeah, I think you can bear with it and deal with it. And I would even say it's worth bearing with and dealing with. Like, I really loved the story and environment, but I'm not very high on the gameplay. I think it's mediocre without being awful.
So structurally, I think there's something here. I don't think these older style point and click adventures nail the formula at all. Like, I think they're quite off the mark. I recently, maybe not recently, within the last 5 years, played a few of the Professor Layton games, which are basically like if you had a walking adventure, but every time you encountered a puzzle, it was entirely self-contained and there was no backtracking or any of that. You just, walked up and somebody said, here's a puzzle, and you did it. And there was no inventory with items in it or anything like that. That was great. It was like all the benefits of the genre, like walking around and talking to people, exploring the world, and getting to do fun puzzles, and none of the tedium. So I do think there is room in this genre to have, really great experiences. But I think this like classical style, that Siberia does and a lot of older games do, does have some major issues that need to kind of be addressed.
So for me, the best like games of this ilk are Paradise Killer and Outer Wilds, which kind of have a not too far removed puzzle structure where you can discover pieces of information in one part of the world which let you solve puzzles in other parts of the world. But that open structure means that if you are having issues or can't get through a certain point, you can just go somewhere else and do something else. And eventually, like once you're a very far way into the game, there are going to be puzzles that you need to solve. But the bulk of your time playing it, if you get stuck, you can just move on to a different puzzle, and you gradually get through the game. And that is far superior than these games where you can get hard gated just because you failed to join two dots. Even if you've got every single other part of the puzzle solved, this one thing will keep you back from making any progress. And I think that's just bad design.
On the whole, I think that the gameplay was engaging. And I thought that the puzzles, I was honestly fairly impressed at how logical most of the things were. There was just one or two times where it was kind of ridiculous, that, it made me frustrated. But, like, as a whole, compared to the rest of the genre, I think that Siberia does do a pretty great job of having, consistently logical puzzles that make sense. So I don't love it, but I found it pretty inoffensive on the whole, other than the walking, which was god awful.
Yeah, that's a fair point to make. For a example of the genre, it's not offensive at all. If you find the genre inherently offensive, well, you're going to have some more troubles.
Yeah, it's not going to change your mind at all. But it's definitely the kind of game where, like, you deal with the gameplay because you love the story so much. That was absolutely the case for me. And although, I had to play this game for the show, and I would have played it regardless of whether I enjoyed it, I felt that I enjoyed the game from start to finish because of how strong the narrative was and how strong, the world building and the environmental art was.
Alrighty, James, final impressions?
Yeah, I mean, I've basically given mine. I think that Syberia is an absolutely fantastic title. It has got probably, one of my favorite settings. I've got to say, I was blown away by how much I enjoyed the setting. This is a game that's set in, like, it's set in our world, but not. But they make the world so vibrant and alive and, semi-believable. It's like a fever dream from start to finish with a really colorful, cast of wistful characters that I adore. If you don't pick it, I'll definitely pick the sequel for the show in the future because I really want to see more of this world going forward. Huge recommend from me.
I'm very high on Syberia. I'm very glad I picked this one as our point and click adventure entry instead of, I guess, the more famous Monkey Island's Day of the Tentacles, because it's very different from those, which which really lean into the absurdist, funny humor. Instead, I got something that's beautifully melancholic about areas of the world where the world has passed by, and I think that Hans's journey and Kate's journey and the places you visit all resonate really well together. It all just feels there's a real consistency in tone here, and I think that my only problem with the story is that it doesn't finish. It only gives you half of it and ends very abruptly. It's very frustrating. I've bought Syberia 2. I'm yet to play it, but I would almost say, even without playing Syberia 2, that you need to buy both parts to enjoy it. And if you see Syberia 1 and Syberia 2 on special, just buy them both together. Because if you get to the end of Syberia 1 and you don't have access to the other half of the game, you're going to be really frustrated. I don't like the gameplay of these games. I think that that's very obvious by now. But as James said, and in the interest of being fair, this isn't this isn't abhorrent by any stretch, and the game does generally avoid the crazy moon logic that is a staple of the genre. And I, as a person who strongly dislikes it, was still able to tolerate it and can still recommend it as a game that you should play and a game that you should enjoy and experience. So definitely recommend it. You should check it out. It exceeded my expectations.
Yeah, really, really happy with this one. So, that brings us towards the end of the show. Patrick, did you want to do a bit of selling us, and then we can move on to what we're playing next fortnight?
I would be absolutely delighted to, James. Firstly, thank you to all of our lovely listeners, and we've got a few new ones, so welcome, and I hope you've enjoyed the episode. James and I make up the Spectives podcast. Each and every fortnight, we play these classic games of the past, and then we do a review to see if it's worth your time to play today. You can find all of our content on our website, which is rspodcast.net. We've got every single episode there, and we've also got a bunch of articles that we've written about the games we've played, and also many modern games and retro games and all kinds of bits and pieces. So please do go check that content out. Most importantly, we would be delighted if you would join our Discord server. James and I love talking about video games, old and new, above and beyond everything else, and we'd love for you to drop by and join the conversation, even if that conversation turns into an argument. I've been getting a lot of grief lately for my repeated gaffes of calling the 4X genre 4 times, and I expect that to continue. So I once again want to apologize to all listeners for me saying that it's called the 4 times genre because it's got 4 E's in it. So my deepest, most sincere apologies. I don't think I'm going to live that one down anytime.
Taking the piss out of the hosts is a common occurrence on Discord, mostly Patrick, but
I want to say I did ask James to remove that from the final edit, and James refused because apparently it was too hilarious to not leave it.
It was.
So thanks, James. Appreciate it.
Oh, you're
James,
welcome.
what are we playing next fortnight? What's on the agenda?
Well, we are actually doing our second ever sequel episode next fortnight. So the episode that has gotten the least ever downloads on our show is Archimedean Dynasty, much to my great disappointment, as its sequel Equinox is a game that I've played from start to finish, a few dozen times, and going back for, the original was something special when we did that episode. So even though I don't expect it to get a lot of views, we're going back to do Equinox because I loved that game, and I suspect that Patrick will enjoy the world and the atmosphere. Or maybe not the atmosphere as much, but the world building of Aqua as, an underwater, dystopian society.
Well, there's plenty of atmosphere down there, James.
That's true. Shut up, Patrick.
I think I made that same joke.
You did.
On the Archimedean Dynasty episode.
Well, Archimedean Dynasty is an underwater shooting adventure. You play in a futuristic submarine, and it's almost like a space combat thing set underwater. So you can stop and turn on a dime and move with like molasses under the deep pressure. So I've always wanted to replay this game because I haven't played it in a good 8 years at this point. Because I remember just loving the world building of this series, and it was true for us when we did Archimedean Dynasty last year, and I hope it'll remain true for now. So hopefully just as good as I remember.
Yeah, I've had a little bit of a look at Equinox. I will say it seems different in some interesting ways.
Oh my god, it's so different.
Archimedean Dynasty was, it wasn't a sim, but it was far more sim-like with the low visibility and kind of like using your keyboard as a console almost and toggling all these nav beacons and all this other stuff. And I looked at Equinox and it seems like a game where you shoot things with your submarine.
Yeah.
So I'm very interested to see the differences because Archimedean Dynasty was a surprise hit for me. I enjoyed it a lot. And this one looks like it's much easier to play, but I don't know if that will be to its detriment or not. So it should be interesting one way or the other.
Yeah, so looking forward to next fortnight's episode quite a bit, and we'll see you then on Retrospectives.